Good morning, and thank you all for joining us. This is the first of its kind, the education series brought to you by the Education Committee of Data. We appreciate your time this morning. I just wanted to give a couple of housekeeping tips. Dr. Wilhelm will moderate the conversation with Dr. Jeneen Fields, and I will be in the background working. My name is Dr. Linnette White, and I serve as the Assistant Director of the Office of Multicultural Programs as the Faculty and Staff Development Director, Assistant Director. I will, as I shared, monitor from the background, admitting folks, keeping mute off as well, and ensuring that I monitor the chat. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat as we go on throughout the presentation, and I'll ensure that your questions are addressed as we move forward. If you find that your question is not addressed, please let me know, and I will definitely make sure that we get your question answered. I will try to keep my questions short simply because I know what the questions are that will be asked throughout the presentation. So I'll try to monitor that as well, so we're not doubling up on questions. All right, with no further ado, I introduce to you our moderator, Dr. Josh Wilhelm.
All right, well, thank you for that introduction and welcome everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Josh Wilhelm. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture and with the Center for Plant Biology. I'm here today representing the Educational Programming Committee for Data, or the Diversity Action Team in Agriculture. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Jeneen Fields. Dr. Fields is a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Botany and Plant Pathology here at Purdue. She's joining us today as our featured guest for one last celebration of Women's History Month. And I have to say this is pretty exciting because this is a 2-for-1 celebration. We get to celebrate and learn from Dr. Fields, who herself is a plant breeder. She's actually believed to be the first African-American woman with a PhD in plant breeding and genetics in the country. Her research focuses on quality trait improvement and disease resistance breeding in legumes. Her newest program also studies how students learn in STEM, and she develops techniques that strengthen learning, engagement, and retention. At the same time, we're going to celebrate the work of Dr. Veronda Montgomery, whom I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute. Utilizing her expertise in plant breeding genetics and as a faculty member doing research in the scholarship of teaching and learning, Dr. Fields has agreed to engage with us in a discussion of Dr. Montgomery's renowned book, Lessons from Plants, and the messages it provides about effective and equitable teaching, mentoring, and leadership practices. So this is meant to be a discussion. I have some prepared questions for Dr. Fields, but I do encourage participation from the audience to ask questions along the way. What I'll do is after I ask my question, we'll give Dr. Fields a chance to respond, and then we can open that up for further discussion with the audience. If you do have a question, please raise your hand, and when called upon, unmute and turn on your camera. Dr. White is going to also be monitoring the chat. So if you would rather ask your question in the chat, Dr. White can relay your question. So before we get started, Dr. Fields, let's learn a little bit more about you. What motivated and/or inspired you to study plant biology and then to go on to become involved in academic science and research around how students learn in STEM?
Thank you, Dr. Woodham. This is an honor actually to be here and talk a little bit about this, but as I begin kind of to talk about my background in plant sciences, I actually really was a person that enjoyed nature and being outside with plants. And one of the fun things is my family, my parents actually realized that early on and encouraged me to just kind of navigate toward areas where I really could cultivate that love of plants. So I was fortunate to attend an agriculture science high school in Philadelphia, one of the few in the nation, where we actually have a full-fledged plant science, animal science program, and agriculture as part of our normal high school curriculum. That was where I fell in love with plants. Actually was teasing one of my high school teachers recently because he was a doctor. And that was the first time I discovered, oh, you can be a plant doctor. This is exciting. And so I was able to just, from that foundation, go on to attend Penn State in undergrad and then follow through with my other degrees. As far as my desire to help students learn, I can literally trace in my mind the number of professors I had in high school, in college, in undergrad, that I really understood. And one of the challenges oftentimes is that as intellectuals, we are very good at gaining an understanding of our information, but I always encourage people that you really have not mastered an ability to understand information until you can communicate it to others in a way that they understand. And so understanding that important point, number one, and then also having experience a handful of wonderful professors when I was in undergrad and in graduate school, it developed a passion to not only acquire and understand information myself, but also be able to communicate that, and really how it can ultimately impact how students learn and even desire to study a certain major. So that became very important to me, and one of the areas that I became very interested in learning more about.
All right, well, thank you for sharing that. So let's talk a little bit about Dr. Montgomery's book, Lessons from Plants. Before I introduce the first question, I just want to give the audience a little bit of background on Dr. Montgomery. So Dr. Veronda Montgomery, she's a writer, and she's a Michigan State University Foundation professor in the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. She has a biological research program that focuses on how photosynthetic organisms, including plants and cyanobacteria, adapt to changes in their environment. But her scholarship extends beyond biology and into studying mentorship and faculty development around developing evidence-based strategies to foster equity and inclusion in faculty development and across academia. I should also mention that starting July 1st, Dr. Montgomery is going to become the next dean of Grinnell College in Iowa. In her renowned book, Lessons from Plants, Dr. Montgomery draws parallels from her own research and observations of plant biology and behavior with her work in studying mentorship and leadership. The book enters into depth of the botanical experience and shows how we can improve human society and our own interactions by better appreciating not just what plants give us, but also how they achieve their own purposes. So Dr. Fields, in the first chapter of the book, which is titled The Changing Environment, Dr. Montgomery talks about plants' extraordinary ability to sense conditions in their environment and to respond to them in order to ensure their own success, as well as that of their mutualistic neighbors. Mm-hmm. How do you think that humans can take cues from plants to survey our own environments in a way that'll help us thrive as individuals as well as part of a community?
I would say if you can look at this as professional in both your personal life, there are different cues that we can certainly take from plants, and Dr. Montgomery expounds on that in the book. But one of the key things is that plants are really able to utilize signals and cues within their system to understand the environment. And so oftentimes they can sense nutrients deficient or present. They can sense the amount of water availability. And there are multiple things that they actually do in order to make those adjustments and make sure that they can persist. If you think about just say, for instance, water availability, in our department, we look at ways that we can develop varieties, say, for instance, that are drought tolerant, or in some cases in the world, it may be even cold tolerant or salt tolerant. But these are some ideal conditions that may be around us that we still have to be able to thrive in those environments. And so an example would be that, you know, over a short time, and we tend to refer to this as microevolution, plants are able to make these adjustments and maybe become salt tolerant plants, or not need as much more water available, so they're drought tolerant, etc. As far as nutrients and different things are available, we know that they have the ability to sometimes produce, say, for instance, even biochemicals that protect them from being harmed by organisms, etc. As human beings, we can definitely take cues, because I think a lot of times we, at different stages in our life, have to make different adjustments, changes in life, professionally, with all the demands. How do you continue to allow yourself to thrive, but still take care of you? And plants tend to do a very beautiful job of that, because one, they do a few things. I would say one of them is, one, they can make those adjustments, but then two, they actually can give off signals, whether biochemical or even physical, that something's wrong. And I would say more cultivated plants were able to address those issues because of those different biochemical signals. You could cite, say, for instance, anthocyanin. Anthocyanin is beneficial to us, but it also is a signal that plants are stressed. So that's one of the ways that plants let the system know that something is not going well. But as scientists, we can always see that. There's just a lot of different cues that you can take, probably more than we can discuss all at one time, but they literally give us a lot of potential ways to definitely be able to make adjustments and thrive.
Thank you for that. Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Yeah, sure.
What advice and strategies would you give to students and to URM or underrepresented minority students and or first generation students in particular when they're coming to the university and surveying their academic environments?
Wow, that's a good one, Josh. If we think about just being, I would say, underrepresented and even first generation, what you're doing is entering an unfamiliar environment. And so you have to definitely be aware of the fact that you are unfamiliar. I have a few slides that I'd love to share at this point to just kind of highlight some of that information. So let's turn to that for just a moment. So if we talk about, say, for instance, what plants understand from a perspective of surviving and being able to thrive, let's see. There are a few things that plants understand out of the gate. And so first of all, that having variety protects us from cessation. So those are fancy terms perhaps, but basically the fact that there is a variety around and you're exposing yourself or have different varieties of plants, they're able to adjust to different situations. And that is one of the things that perpetuates or allows the species to continue to exist. Another thing is variety is beneficial because it allows you to basically incorporate the necessary traits in the genome and in the gene pool. So as I talk to students, one of the things that I always try to encourage them and my colleagues professionally is to be open to different situations, different scenarios, people. All of us have such different backgrounds, but it's really, really important if we as a people are going to thrive, that we begin to incorporate maybe some of the things that we're not as familiar with. Also, plants understand that variety is the springboard of developing even new species and improvement. So as we talk about speciation and how, like, literally you could have one variety, I was speaking to my botany class earlier this week talking about a species of E. coli. And, there's basically a foundational species, K12 of E. coli, that a lot of the initial research was done on, but then there's also literally the same genus and species, type of E. coli that's more associated with foodborne illnesses. Literally, it has similar genetics and everything, but they are clearly different varieties, quote unquote, of that bacteria. So it's really, really important to have those different things present so that we understand and can study, but then ultimately so we can thrive. If we look at why it's important to value differences, one of the things I always tell students is that differences create just a better situation. So if you even look at these two photos, you have a basic pile of broccoli, but then you have this other pile that has broccoli and it has red cabbage and it has onions and peppers, but this variety, one of these clearly looks more appetizing than the other. And so I encourage students that even as an underrepresented minority, you're becoming part of this pool. And while at the beginning, it may not always be appreciated, as you move to the second picture, you realize that a whole lot more nutrients, sustainability, and really what you need to survive is found more in that second picture than in the first. As we talk a little bit about just why variety is important, you can literally see the progression of, say, for instance, the salad, and why adding all these different components make a difference. And so a lot of times as people, we have to ask the hard questions of ourselves, like, what opinions do you have if we look at humans that about things you've never experienced? So a lot of times as they're moving into this environment, say for instance, professionally, you're coming into an environment, and I'll just say it the way it is, as say for instance, the first African-American person in a department, or a few of the number of African-American students, or the first or only a few Asian students in the department, you have to be able to be open to experiences and really begin to drop the opinions that you may have about things and people that you've never experienced. And then the thing I also tell them a lot of times as US citizens, initially, a lot of us grow up right around the population of people and things that we grew up around, and we're not exposed to very much. So you have to, in a collegiate environment, this is one of the times where you can truly, truly open up your heart and your mind to develop stronger and greater experiences, and really, truly be open to that. And then finally, I often tell them, you have to ask yourself the hard question: will you just remain inexperienced and underexposed? And as we talk more about this, I can just share. So if we talk about exposure and allowing yourself to be open, most of us are familiar with a banana, a pear. And if we want to get a little fancy, we can even talk about a kiwi. Now, kiwis were not real prevalent when I was a child, but now that's more of a common fruit that we find seasonally in America. And we typically are pretty comfortable with these fruit, right? However, what about these? The canepa, the grenadier fruit, the pacai. Don't they look appetizing? Not really. Well, this happens to be a group of fruits that I've come across in the last so many years of my travels. And I'll remember the first time I came across them, I stood back and I was like, this is different. I don't know if I even want to taste that. That looks like nothing I've ever seen. So am I going to be open and allow myself to even partake of these? Well, interesting enough, the canepa, it is so unique because this happens to be a fruit that grows pretty widespread in Puerto Rico. And it literally, it has the texture of the skin peel of an orange, but it kind of is structured in a cluster like grapes, and it tastes like grapes a little bit on the inside, but maybe a little sweeter and different. I was not open initially to really trying this because it was unfamiliar. Same thing with the grenadier fruit. This is, and the pacai. Both of these are two fruits that I've come into contact with during my travels in Peru. And the grenadier is actually in the passion fruit family. So most of us are familiar with passion fruit juice, but how many of us have ever eaten a grenadier or a passion fruit? Well, interesting enough, it has all these little pustules on the inside, tastes really like grapes, but it's softer. And then the center is crunchy, but the seed is actually edible. Delightful. It was so wonderful to experience. But initially, when I held the fruit, I was like, how do you even open this thing? You take it and you push it, and it's like an egg almost to break open. And I'm like, this is so weird. But then it gets completely soft and delicious on the inside. And then lastly, the pacai. Well, that is absolutely ugly on the outside. I'm like, who eats this at all? When you peel it open, when you see the center, you actually peel the seeds out, and the covering on the seeds tastes like vanilla ice cream. So I often ask myself, when we're dealing with new situations and having to learn about others and be exposed to different backgrounds, is our problem that we're just unopened? Or is it that we are underexposed and things are unfamiliar? So these are questions that I encourage my colleagues to ask all of us to ask ourselves as we're experiencing life. And these are some of the really important things that I think I've gained from just some of the plant experiences and exposures I've had just looking at fruit. So you have to literally challenge yourself to grow. You have to be able to know the past and be able to deal with current situations. And even when we look at, like, say, for instance, diversity, we want to try to move things forward. Finally, I'll just say, as we even talk about different environments and experiencing different people, the origins, we look at the origins of even race and things of that nature. And I've talked to this topic in many of my other classes other than my botany class, but I've asked my students, like, where the origin of race even come from? Why is it that, we feel like a covering makes us superior? Does a grape skin, is it better than a canapa skin? No, it's just different. But the outside somehow makes one feel superior or inferior. And it's just not relevant when you think about the truth of life. Again, those are some of the things that plants have really kind of taught me. And so I encourage students and professionals to think through some of those things, to allow yourself to be open, to do the thing that is unfamiliar, because often you can find that you grow and you experience some wonderful things that you never had before.
Well, thank you for that. We had a couple messages come through in the chat commenting on some of the different fruits. So there are some people in the audience who've tried some of these.
Awesome. That is good. That is good. Continue to expand your experience. I mean, I've recently become more aware that, gosh, we're not even experiencing a quarter of the fruit in the world. So it's interesting.
Well, seeing that there are no other questions right now, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next theme. So another interesting takeaway from Dr. Montgomery's book comes in the second chapter, Friend or Foe. And the theme here is that plants form relationships with other plants, fungi, bacteria in the soil. And sometimes these can be collaborative and sometimes they can be competitive. And she talks about how in competitive situations that plants have evolved strategies to avoid expending excess energy, whereas in collaborative situations, they forge beneficial relationships that yield success, sustain life, and promote longevity. So what lessons do you think we can take away from here about plants when thinking about enriching our own professional networks?
Yeah, I think of several things. And one of the real good examples kind of comes from some of the things she shares, and kind of what I say is a situation of how you view your situation as a plant, as a person in, say, for instance, a certain circumstance. So as far as beneficial relationships, I think it's important to ask yourself, beneficial, what does that really mean? How do you define it? And one of the things that I am an advocate of is what I call symbiosis. That's a plant principle in many cases where you have say, for instance, sometimes bacteria and a plant part, but basically they're helping one another. I'm helping you, you're helping me. Some of the good examples in plant science would be, say, for instance, rhizobia and nodules and legumes. So if you look at that symbiotic relationship, there are times where you partner with people because those relationships are beneficial, but there are even times where those beneficial relationships may not be what's familiar to you and may not be what's even most comfortable. I'll give you a personal example of mine recently. So as a new professor in our department, I recently had to choose my mentoring committee. And so typically, out of the comfort of which you always do, people will choose people that think like them, people that they think they get along with, people that, just like them. That is our inclination. However, what plants do, and then oftentimes we can mimic, is to find those relationships that are beneficial, but maybe the people are a little different. They think different. You may not always agree about everything, but the whole thing is in the relationship, you can challenge one another to grow. And even sometimes those people can open up your perspective about a view that you did not see. So I think those are really, really important things to do as you're building your professional network, to not always go to what's familiar, to reach out to someone that's completely different. They may have a total different view about subject matters and how to approach things. Because as scientists, I think that's also where our inquiry is stimulated, and a lot of times we can learn and grow.
Thank you for that. Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Sure.
So with that in mind, what do you think are the implications for individuals from marginalized or first generation backgrounds that may have trouble tapping into networks of knowledge in academic or professional settings?
Oh, I think it's always interesting because, I actually teach a women in ag, say for instance, that class, a women in ag leadership class. And one of the things that I find is that our girls come in pretty hesitant and maybe even a little quiet about what they know, or even as they're growing in their knowledge, a little hesitant to express it. And one of the things that I often have to talk to them about is being able to open your mouth and use your voice, and even not be afraid to make a mistake in your verbiage, because even in those situations, you're able to learn and grow. So, it could go for underrepresented. And when I say underrepresented, I don't mean just people, that can you can look at so many different backgrounds. It could be women, it could be racial, it could be disability, etc. But you have to be willing to ask the questions, to verbalize, to even put yourself out there and not kind of sink back in a corner, because it's important that they understand you're here for a reason. And like, I even go back to the foundation that, Purdue doesn't accept everybody. So the fact that you're here, the fact that you happen to be a woman and you met all the criteria, that should give you some reason to celebrate and know that you belong. Sometimes you may have to help people along with helping them understand you belong, but you have to have that internal confidence and fortitude that you belong and that you have something to contribute, and then get about contributing.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I want to remind everyone that we're happy to take questions along the way. You can either raise your hand and speak up, or post them in the chat, and Dr. White will alert us that there are questions there. Well, I want to move on to another theme. So thinking about in the 4th chapter of the book, Dr. Montgomery touches on the idea of transformation. And so she gives examples of resiliency of plants, and she ultimately ties that to their ability to perceive and respond to their environments, like we've talked about a little bit already. But she also touches on how plants can change or shape their environments. And so she introduces the concept of succession and plant ecosystem change. And she talks about how ecosystem change is first initiated by what she calls pioneer plants, which are plants that have minimal requirements for resources and transform the environment in ways that clear a path for subsequent generations or subsequent species to become established and to thrive and be successful, leading to a more diverse ecosystem. So when thinking about making significant institutional or human ecosystem change in the pursuit of equity, what lessons do you think we can take from plants here?
Okay, so when you began asking that question, I actually thought about 2 different things. So I'm going to, I guess, approach the first one and then go to the second one. And so one of them is weeds. I thought about weeds because I remember years ago, I was in my PhD program and I was walking in the field, soybean field, of course, and evaluating some plants. And, right there in the middle of my beautiful lines of, resistant, GMO, herbicide tolerant plants is this very lush, thriving weed. And I literally stood there for a moment and I looked at it and I began to wonder about this weed. And I was just literally like, this little weed in the field, how is it that you sustain? You're here among all of these other plants that are unlike you, but somehow you have this signal, this DNA in you that tells you that your direction is to thrive. And you're doing it. That was earlier on. And I think by the time I graduated from that program, at that point, there had been about 88 herbicide resistant weeds documented in the state of Tennessee. And I was pretty fascinated by it because literally these plants have undergone a level of, we even say microevolution, to allow them to adjust and be able to be resistant to this herbicide that's supposed to kill them. And in many cases and places, as people, sometimes we have to be that way. You've got to survey your environment. And then a lot of times you have to make internal adjustments in order for you to be able to sustain and thrive even in that environment. And so many times, just like I looked at that weed, people can look and be like, how is it that you're still standing? You're still thriving, knowing all this has been thrown at you or whatever has taken place has. And it is really the human ability, just like the weeds, to adjust and pay attention to that initial signal, which is, I want to live, I want to thrive. And that kind of is interesting. But also one particular weed that I thought was pretty fascinating is called Palmer Amaranth. The interesting thing about that particular weed is that it became a really big, problem in Tennessee at the time, and it still is in a lot of fields, mainly because not only did it adjust, but it is a large producer of seed. So not only did it learn to thrive, but then it said, I've learned to thrive and I've got to continue to figure out ways to perpetuate itself. So it produces an enormous number of seeds in order to continue to distribute itself. So it won't, go through cessation, as we say. But, even in that, one of my friends from Africa, we were just talking and she was telling me that there are types of amaranth that are actually used for, nutrient sources in Africa. So I began to even think about it differently and say, we're trying to, now that this weed has become very strong and sort of overtaken the environment, we are constantly trying to figure out ways to make it not do that. But maybe we just need to incorporate it and see, maybe we can test the nutrient composition of it or something and see, does it have any nutrient value? And maybe not fight it, but join it. I don't know. But I see, actually, interesting enough, one of my colleagues from Weed Science is on here, so I think he'll get a chuckle out of that. But yeah, we're continuing to try to find ways to not let that plant overcome. But the weeds have a very wonderful way of being an example now of how things can adjust and still thrive.
Are there any other questions or follow-ups? So I have one other follow-up to talking about this idea of pioneer plants that Dr. Montgomery introduces, and these being the first emergent plants in a new or barren environment that kind of paved the way for other plants to come. And so taking this analogy of pioneer plants a little bit further, if initial leaders in human institutions function like pioneer plants, what strategies or resources do you think we need to have in place to promote identification, recruitment, retention of individuals who are going to follow those leaders that are going to sustain long-term cultural change in our institutions? And how do we ensure the success of those second waves of individuals?
I guess what I would say on that note, that this is where one of those wonderful places that variety comes into place. I think oftentimes we make the mistake of, say, for instance, if you're promoting the idea of women, that you hire a bunch of women. If you're promoting the idea of ethnic diversity, that you may hire a large number of Asians or a large number of African Americans, et cetera. I think that misses the point, because you could go through the whole entire process, but then what you have is pockets of people, but you've not cultivated any kind of change. What you have to do is, kind of going back to the pictures I showed about the uncommon fruit, encourage people to find a way to invest in each other's lives. I remember, and I'll share this with people, when I went to high school, up until that point, I had never gone to school with anyone but African-American children. And I had perceptions and ideas about things just like anyone else did. You know, in Philadelphia, the Black folks stayed on the Black side of town, the Italian people stayed on the Italian side, you know, the white people stayed on the white side. And it was all these different broken pockets of everything. Well, our school was very unique. And so students from all over the city, for the first time, found themselves in a situation where we had diversity of every kind, all in one school. And clearly we had our academic classes, but when it came to actually executing many of the things we had to do in our agriculture classes, we had to work as a team. So it didn't matter what our background was. It didn't matter what our skin covering was. It didn't matter. We had to rely on each other to, you know, hold the cow's tail. So when we were doing the brushing, somebody didn't get, you know, stuff on it that they didn't want, or, you know, we're working through these different processes. We're having to collect eggs, and we've got to make sure that somebody holds the chicken and someone is able to get the eggs out and someone else is able to package. When we're working on our different plant projects, we've got to make sure that, say, for instance, the water takes place in a certain way. And when we were raising poinsettias, that somehow we made sure that light didn't get exposed to those bracts during the time where they were supposed to go through coloring. So it's a lot of teamwork. Oddly enough, because we had to work and rely on one another, a lot of the issues that we grew up with, or even misconceptions that we had, began to fade, because now you're not just Jeneen from North Philadelphia, you're part of my plant science team, and we've got to get this project done. So that is one of the situations where I think, as scientists, as communities, even, you know, here at Purdue, and as leaders, encouraging more collaboration and for people to come out of the comfort of their own little pockets, I think begins to develop more of that. And I think also people begin to see the value that each other can contribute, that it's not just this person over there in their pocket doing their work and I can't learn anything, but I can learn something from the plant. You know, I'm in plant biology and plant pathology, but I can learn something from weed science. Weed science can learn something from me. I can learn something from entomology. This person is over here and you know, a different type of pest management, and I can learn about that. But it holistically makes us better scientists and better communities when we can force ourselves out of those pockets. I think academia is one of the few places where that's even allowed, because I was an industry scientist before I came here, and our team had to come together. And it didn't really matter about your background. You were a scientist on a certain project, and our teams worked wonderfully because it was necessary in order to get the job done. So, you know, how leadership can encourage that, they can encourage it. It's not necessarily always demanded in this environment, but for the people that want to grow and want to even begin to be those, I would say, beginners and involved in transformation, you literally have to make yourself go do something that's uncomfortable. Go have lunch with somebody that is completely out of your normal circle, and even maybe make you a little uncomfortable. And one of the things you typically find is, wow, this person and I have more in common than I thought. So it has to be some sense of wanting to grow as a human being yourself, because we can all just stay comfortable where we are. But for progression, and what I will tell you also, this generation coming behind us, either you are going to make an adjustment or you're going to become irrelevant, because they literally aren't very accepting of the separation that we tend to tolerate.
Thank you for that. A lot of good insight there. So I want to move ahead to another theme, and I admit that this was probably one of my favorite themes that came away from my reading of the book, and that was in chapter 6, titled Plan for Success.
Okay.
And so throughout the book, Dr. Montgomery talked a lot about lessons and strategies that we can learn from plants, but those came from plants in their natural communities. Ironically, though, a lot of the interactions that most of us have with plants come from things like tending our gardens, taking care of our house plants, taking care of crops. And so we humans are providing interventions as caretakers of plants. One of my favorite quotes from the book, it's on page 121, where Dr. Montgomery says, "How do we help a houseplant that is not thriving? To problem solve, we generally focus on what is lacking in or what is wrong with the environment. Or alternatively, what is wrong with the caretaker? We rarely ask whether the plant itself is incapable of growth or demonstrating success." And this was, came off as very powerful to me, because it challenges the deficit thinking that I think a lot of people fall into.
Right.
And so when thinking about how this compares to human nature, when it comes to mentoring or coaching, what do you think are some strategies that we can take away here to get away from deficit-based thinking?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one, Josh, because, I think a lot of times when we're mentoring people, you have to kind of take the time to have an overall assessment of who the person is, and a lot of times what their strengths are, as well as their weaknesses. Unfortunately, a lot of times we tend to focus on their weaknesses and say, well, you got to make this area better. You got to make this area better. But those weaknesses probably may encompass about 30% of the person, or 20% of the person. And they've got this whole area of strengths and ways that they can flourish. And so one strategy is to build up those areas where they're strong, and to allow them to develop those areas. What it tends to do is it tends to make many of those weaknesses irrelevant. But then also I have, I guess when I think about mentoring and helping people grow, I'm a proponent of what I call constructive criticism. So it's important to be able to allow people to speak to you about an area that needs development, but also on us as incumbent to frame it in a way where you're not tearing the person down or making them feel incapable of doing something. So I again can share some examples, but I remember my first draft of my thesis in my master's study. I was so proud of it. I was so excited. I thought I was a great writer. Excellent. Turned it in to my professor at the time, and he gave me back the paper, and it was marked up with so much red. As I flipped through the pages, I was like, oh, okay, he's got a red streak. Okay, more. And by the time I got to the end of the document and I'm standing right there in front of him, I was in complete tears. And he just looked at me and he said, what's going on. And I said, I thought the document was good. He said, Jeneen, the content is good. He said, your writing is not. He said, but you are in the process of development. No, it was actually my proposal. That's what it was. So he said, you're in the process of development. And the goal here is to make you a better writer through this entire time you're here. And if you decide to go on to a higher degree, you'll be good at writing. And he said, there's a difference between criticism that's just given to tear you down and criticism that's meant to make you stronger. And until that point in my life, no one had ever distinguished that for me. So I'm an advocate of constructive criticism. I won't hold back at all when I know it's a detrimental area that, say, for instance, a student, a colleague, et cetera, needs to work on. But at the same time, I'm always going to be the person that magnifies and pushes a person to accentuate their strengths as well. Because I think, again, you can work on those things that are necessary so that you can thrive and do well if they're detrimental. But then to focus on weaknesses, I don't think that does anyone good. I think that when you are able to focus on a person's strengths and allow them to develop in those areas, you get the best, I would say, symbiosis even of it. If that person's there to help you do something and you're there to get something done, both of you bring unique strengths to the situation. And so I think it's important to allow that to develop. And like I said, work on those areas that are detrimental and could sabotage, but definitely tend toward the person's strengths.
That's really great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Just to kind of circle back on this idea of, comparing the way we approach taking care of and cultivating plants with the way we mentor. And when I say we, I mean, I don't necessarily mean everyone, but by and large, right, we treat plants differently than we treat humans, right? When a plant fails to grow, we ask what we did wrong, what's wrong with its environment. And oftentimes when a student's not doing well, we say, well, what's wrong with the student, right? And so how do we change that mindset to think more like we do how we take care of plants?
Well, I think that's an interesting question at this time, because as part of my SOTA work, one of the things that I have been challenged over the years is to develop how I can make the learning more effective. And I've had to ask myself questions about, well, if I do this, students tend to do better. But if I do that, students tend not to do better. And you find different techniques along the way. As academics, one of the challenges often is we're intelligent. We know we're intelligent. They don't give out the PhD degree. So if you've got there, you've worked for it and you've executed a certain level of expertise to get it. But we're not always committed to lifetime learning. And we're not always committed to taking the knowledge that's in our head and making sure we transfer it in a way that there's understanding. So if you look at, say, for instance, a room, and that's just how I often gauge understanding. And I'm glad we're like getting back to where we can see each other in person again. But if you're ever given a seminar in a room or even teaching in a class and you notice the nods stop and eyes start to glaze over, that is a cue that comprehension is not taking place. But as professors, oftentimes what we do is we just keep talking. We just keep going and we've covered the material and no comprehension is taking place, but we're done. And then the students leave the room. And if you have to ask questions, like for instance, I use hot seat in my lessons oftentimes, that gives me an indication along the way if the students are getting what I'm talking about. Literally, if I notice that a large number of students aren't grasping a concept even after a hot seat, I will go back and say, okay, well, I see 40% of the students got this correct, or even 70% of the students got this correct, but 30% of you didn't quite get this. So this is why this is correct. And this is why this part is incorrect. Do you have any questions? And I encourage that interaction so that we can have the dialogue back and forth and bring about clarifying points. As professors, a lot of times we have gotten into the habit of monologuing. And that is typically how teaching and learning takes place. If there is not a dialogue, you imagine sitting somewhere and there's always a one-way conversation. Well, theoretically, you're taking in knowledge, but sometimes you're not. So even as I would say professors, we've got to slow down at times and ask the question. If you can look out in the audience and see eyes glazed over, no one understands what you're saying. So what is the point of getting to the finish line with nobody? I think one of my favorite statements is, if you are taking a walk, no, if you are leading and no one is following, you're just taking a walk. A lot of times as professors, we get to the finish line and we just took a walk. We don't have students along with us. So I think that part is really, really important, to make sure that we're asking those vital questions. Is there a way that I could tweak this or look at this differently in order to make sure that true communication has taken place? Can my students give me back and help me see that they understand before I give an exam? That's one of the concepts that we've recently begun to implement in our recitation. Normally, our recitation is that we spend that time actually reinforcing some of the concepts we've studied earlier in the week, and students have different learning projects that they have to execute on. But now what I do every 3 weeks is I flip the classroom and I allow them to present back to me. During that time, we can actually cover every single concept right before an exam, and then we actually can make correction in class. I encourage them to ask questions, and I encourage them to try, even if they know it might be wrong, or even if they get it wrong. I don't embarrass them. I say, okay, this part you have correct, here's where you went wrong. And the corrective process, even in that, helps them to ultimately, I think, perform better on the exams. And we're beginning to see that. So we've got to revisit how we're doing things at times to make sure that we can continue to assure real education is taking place. I'll say that.
Thank you for that. So we do have a question that came through in the chat, and this is circling back to the previous topic where we were talking about pioneer plants and humans as initial leaders at institutions paving the way for the next wave of people. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, how do we as a college, faculty and staff, do a better job of modeling this idea for our students, or do a better job of getting our students to see this is happening in the college? And I think this came up in the context of your answer about talking about going to lunch with a person that you maybe don't typically interact with. How do we model that kind of behavior for students?
I mean, there are ways that we can do it. And again, I think at times it requires that you not always be the front face of everything. Our Botany 110 class is a really large class, and there are intermittent times as I'm redeveloping some of the lessons that I am thinking more about inviting some of my colleagues in to give an experience, to share, not to take up all their time. So I wouldn't ask them to do an entire lecture, but to come in and give 15 or 20 minutes to expound on their particular area of research. It means that, yeah, I have to step back for a moment as a professor, but it's modeling for my students that I'm not the only one doing this, and there are other people in my department engaged in all types of fascinating research. So how is it that I can take this topic of ecology and bring someone that has a specialty in ecology in? How is it, could I take this area of pathology and bring a pathologist in it? Say, for instance, the area of weed science, or, you know, the area of biotechnology, even if it's just 15 minutes. I always try to be respectful of other people's time, and I don't want to ever be a person that's like, okay, well, you come do the whole lecture. If they're open to it, you know, perhaps, yeah, I did ask a professor that formerly taught our course to come in and do a second lecture on our biotechnology this year. But I think it's beneficial that they see us working in networks and sharing that, yeah, I'm an expert in this area, but they're like this person doing this, and this person's over here solving this problem. And while I'm working on soybean, well, we have this other pathologist that's working specifically on frog eye leaf spot. And there's a very different kind of research that has to take place. So students are not only just learning, but they're seeing how we can work together and begin to, you know, form networks, and hopefully they mimic that. Also in our recitation groups, we actually put together recitation groups this semester that the students are staying in for the entire semester. So they have to work together and they're forming a network. But what I found out is actually some of them are starting study groups within those networks. So they're supporting one another. But those are just some of the things that we can model, I think, from the classroom that helps students understand that there, again, is a symbiosis. We need each other. And a lot of times success happens alone, but it can explode if we work together.
Well, so we are at about time. But before we depart, I wanted to give you the opportunity to share any final thoughts or anything else you would like to share with us about you.
I mean, I think as time goes on, I'll get to know more and more of our colleagues, but I just encourage everyone to, you know, open up their minds and think about different ways that across departments, within departments, we can work together to build, I would say, more collaboration. Because I think if you even say, for instance, look at COVID, and one of the things that I talk to students about a lot of times is people always have this question of how we get a vaccine so quick. Well, one, people don't realize a few things happen. The first thing is that for the first time, probably in the history of our world, both private, public, and academic industry all work together. The second thing, that there was 30 years of foundational knowledge, because the cold virus is actually a type of coronavirus. It just wasn't COVID-19, but there was some foundational research to build on. Well, goodness, what could we get done if we truly stop talking about it and actually put our expertise together to build some projects? So I encourage all of us to think about those types of things and how we can bring in each other's expertise and stop struggling over here by ourselves and build an empire.
Okay, well, that is all the time we have for today. I want to thank everyone for attending today, and I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Jeneen Fields, one more time for sharing her insight and perspective on lessons we can learn from plants when it comes to more effective and equitable teaching, mentoring, and leadership. So thank you.
Thank you.